Toxic people are not disturbed by emotional people. They are trained for that. They know how to handle anger, explanations, emotional reactions, and long conversations. What unsettles them is someone who becomes emotionally unavailable to manipulation. Someone who stops reacting instantly. Someone who stops explaining every decision. Someone who stops giving emotional access on demand. Because the moment they can no longer predict your reactions, they lose the psychological control they were quietly depending on. This is why calm people often intimidate toxic individuals without even trying. Emotional discipline creates uncertainty. Silence creates pressure. Self-control removes access. The 7 habits described here quietly change the way manipulative people experience your presence. Once these habits become natural to you, toxic people stop feeling powerful around you and start feeling exposed instead. You stop giving people emotional access to your mind. Most people do not realize they are handing over psychological control every single day. Not through dramatic confrontations. Not through obvious vulnerability. Through small, consistent patterns of behavior that signal to others exactly how to reach them, move them, and destabilize them whenever it becomes useful. Emotional access is not just about crying in front of someone or sharing your deepest fears. Emotional access is given every time you react immediately to a provocative comment. Every time you feel compelled to justify a decision that requires no justification. Every time you check your phone anxiously after sending a message. Every time you adjust your behavior because you sensed someone's disapproval even though they said nothing. These micro behaviors send a continuous signal to the people around you, and toxic individuals read those signals better than most. Manipulative personalities are unusually skilled at identifying emotional access points. They do not necessarily plan this consciously. It becomes a refined instinct developed over years of learning which behaviors extract reactions from others. They learn your rhythms. They learn what makes you explain yourself. They learn what makes you feel guilty. They learn what makes you overcompensate. And once they have mapped your emotional access points, those points become levers. When you stop giving emotional access, you are not becoming cold. You are not building a wall. You are doing something far more sophisticated. You are becoming selective about what receives your emotional energy. There is a critical distinction between someone who is emotionally unavailable and someone who is emotionally disciplined. An emotionally unavailable person cannot connect. An emotionally disciplined person chooses when and how they connect, and that choice itself is a form of psychological power. The first shift happens internally. You begin noticing the difference between a genuine emotional response and a conditioned reaction. A genuine emotional response comes from your own internal experience. A conditioned reaction comes from someone else's stimulus, their tone, their silence, their implication, their passive aggression. When you start distinguishing between the two, you realize how much of what you feel in certain interactions is not actually yours. It was placed there deliberately to create a movement in you that serves someone else's agenda. Toxic individuals depend on emotional spillover. When something upsets you, they need that upset to be visible. When something excites you, they need access to that excitement so they can calibrate how much power it gives them over you. When you are anxious, your anxiety tells them they are winning. When you are guilty, your guilt tells them the manipulation is working. Every visible emotion becomes data they use to adjust their approach. The practice of limiting emotional access begins with a simple discipline. You learn to pause before responding. Not a performative pause designed to look calm. An actual internal pause where you ask yourself one question. Is this response mine, or is it being extracted from me? That question alone begins separating your genuine reactions from manufactured ones. And over time, that separation grows. What once triggered an immediate emotional flood begins producing a measured, considered response instead. Not because you stopped feeling, because you stopped performing your feelings on demand. Toxic people do not just use your emotional reactions against you. They use your emotional predictions. They anticipate how you will respond and build their strategies around those predictions. When you become emotionally disciplined, their predictions fail. They push a button that used to produce a reaction and nothing happens. That failure of prediction creates anxiety inside manipulative individuals, because now they are the ones operating without a map. You will notice something interesting when you begin withdrawing emotional access. Certain people will escalate. They will push harder, provoke more directly, create bigger situations designed to force the emotional response they are no longer receiving organically. This is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. This is evidence that your emotional access was genuinely something they depended on. The escalation is withdrawal behavior. It is what happens when a system loses its fuel source and begins malfunctioning. Stay measured during escalation. Your continued calmness during their escalation sends the clearest possible message that the access they once had no longer exists. That message, delivered without words, without confrontation, without explanation, is the most powerful communication you can offer. The goal is not to become robotic. The goal is to become internally sovereign. Your emotions remain yours, fully alive, fully felt, fully genuine. But the decision about when those emotions become visible belongs entirely to you. That sovereignty, once established, fundamentally changes every relationship in your life. Your silence starts interrupting manipulation. Silence is one of the most misunderstood psychological tools available to a human being. Most people treat silence as an absence, as nothing happening. But in the context of human interaction, silence is never nothing. Silence is active. Silence communicates. Silence creates pressure, generates uncertainty, and interrupts psychological patterns that depend on constant verbal engagement to survive. Toxic people and manipulative personalities specifically depend on conversational momentum. Their strategies require response. When they make an implication, they need you to respond, because your response tells them whether the implication landed and how much it affected you. When they create confusion, they need you to clarify, because your clarification reveals your anxiety. When they attack, they need you to defend, because defense confirms the premise of the attack and keeps you in a reactive position. Every manipulation strategy is built around a predictable response pattern. Silence breaks that pattern at its foundation. Think about what actually happens when a manipulative person says something designed to provoke and receives silence instead of a reaction. First, they experience confusion. Their internal model of you predicted a response, and no response arrived. Second, that confusion rapidly generates discomfort. The discomfort is not about your silence itself. It is about what your silence implies. It implies that their attempt did not penetrate. It implies that they misjudged you. Third, that discomfort pushes them toward behavioral changes that begin revealing their true psychological architecture. Some people attempt a second provocation, more aggressive. Some immediately soften and try to reconnect. Some become visibly anxious. Each of these responses tells you exactly what you need to know about their intentions. There are different categories of silence that serve different functions. The first is absorptive silence. This is the silence you hold after someone says something inflammatory or manipulative. Rather than immediately reacting, you simply let the words land. You do not reject them outwardly. You do not accept them. You let them exist in the space between you while your face remains composed and your energy remains still. Absorptive silence communicates something specific, that you heard what was said, that you are not alarmed by it, and that you are not compelled to respond immediately. The second category is deliberate silence, the intentional choice to withhold information, clarification, or explanation that someone is clearly seeking. When a toxic person asks pointed questions designed to extract emotional data from you, deliberate silence is the refusal to feed that process. You are not rude. You are not hostile. You simply do not answer questions that serve another person's intelligence gathering about your emotional vulnerabilities. The third category is companionable silence. Silence that you are clearly comfortable with, that you do not rush to fill. People who are uncomfortable with silence fill it constantly. They talk to reduce their own anxiety. Toxic individuals learn to use this filling behavior. They ask open-ended questions and simply wait, knowing that your discomfort with silence will cause you to keep talking until you say something useful to them. When you become genuinely comfortable with silence, that strategy collapses entirely. Silence also functions as a mirror. When someone is speaking manipulatively and they receive composed silence in response, they are forced to continue speaking. And in continuing to speak without your reactive participation, they begin revealing more than they intended. Manipulative narratives require constant calibration against your responses. Without your responses as calibration data, the manipulation often becomes increasingly transparent. People say more than they planned. They contradict themselves. They reveal the emotional need underneath the strategy. The final dimension of this habit is patience. Silence requires patience because manipulation often escalates before it retreats. The moment you stop responding predictably, certain individuals will intensify their efforts, becoming louder, more dramatic, more accusatory, all in an attempt to force the reaction that silence is withholding. The ability to remain silent and composed during this escalation is where the real psychological shift occurs. Because at that point, the manipulative person is performing entirely for an audience that has stopped watching. And nothing dismantles a performance more completely than the removal of a responsive audience. 3. You become harder to read under pressure. Psychological legibility operates constantly in every interaction you have. When someone can read you easily, when your face, your body, your tone, and your behavior consistently and immediately reflect your internal state, you become an open book. And open books are easy to strategize against. Toxic individuals do not need to understand you deeply. They need to read you accurately in the moment. When they can do that reliably, they can predict your responses, time their manipulations, and adjust their approach based on real-time feedback your legible reactions provide. Becoming harder to read removes that operational advantage entirely. The mechanics of becoming harder to read begin with facial control. Micro-expressions, brief, involuntary facial movements lasting fractions of a second, broadcast emotional states before the conscious mind even processes them. Most people leak these micro-expressions constantly. They do not know they are doing it. They believe they are maintaining a neutral expression while their face has already communicated surprise, anxiety, contempt, or satisfaction to anyone skilled enough to notice. Toxic personalities often become very skilled at noticing, not through formal training, but through years of behavioral adaptation that requires reading people accurately to maintain social control. The practice of facial discipline is not about becoming expressionless or robotic. It is about developing the ability to maintain a chosen expression rather than automatically reflecting internal states. This is a trainable skill. It begins with awareness, simply noticing what your face does in various emotional states. Over time, awareness becomes management. You begin noticing in real time when your face wants to react and making a deliberate choice about whether that reaction serves you. Body language follows the same principle. Nervous movement, touching the face, shifting weight, crossing and uncrossing arms, adjusting clothing, provides continuous information to observers about your internal state. Stillness communicates composure regardless of what is happening internally. When you learn to remain physically still under pressure, you project a quality that manipulative individuals find genuinely difficult to navigate, because stillness implies depth that cannot be accessed. Vocal tone is often the most revealing legibility channel. When people are under pressure, their voice rises in pitch, increases in speed, or becomes more emphatic. Learning to maintain a measured, consistent vocal pace and tone under pressure requires practice, but the result is dramatic. When your voice does not change during a tense interaction, the person attempting to provoke you receives no auditory confirmation that they are succeeding. That absence of confirmation is destabilizing. There is an important distinction between genuinely not reacting and suppressing reactions. Suppression is taxing, leaky, and ultimately unsustainable. Genuine non-reactivity comes from a different psychological place. It comes from having processed the emotional trigger through a sufficiently developed internal framework that the trigger no longer produces the same automatic response. This takes time to build, but it is built through consistent practice rather than white-knuckled suppression. Being harder to read also involves managing what you verbalize. Most people externalize their processing. They think out loud, share uncertainty in real time, ask questions that reveal their concerns. Internal processing, genuinely sitting with a thought or emotion before verbalizing it, produces a completely different interactional quality. When you speak, you are not offering a window into your processing. You are offering a considered output. The processing itself remains private. Under pressure specifically, the habit of becoming harder to read produces a counterintuitive effect. When toxic individuals cannot read you, they become readable themselves. They increase their probing behavior, asking more questions, making more provocative statements, testing different angles, all in an attempt to generate the data your composed exterior is not providing. This increased probing makes their intentions more transparent. The more you withhold behavioral data, the more they reveal strategic intent in their attempt to extract it. Toxic people realize they cannot provoke you anymore. Provocation is the primary diagnostic tool of manipulative personalities. Before committing to a specific manipulation strategy, they probe. They make small comments designed to produce reactions. They create minor inconveniences to observe how you handle frustration. They offer subtle criticisms to see how sensitive you are to evaluation. They test boundaries with small violations before attempting larger ones. This probing phase is often so subtle that most people do not recognize it as the strategic assessment it actually is. When the probing is complete and a manipulative individual has established a clear picture of your reactive patterns, they begin deploying targeted provocations, stimuli specifically calibrated to produce the reactions they have identified as consistent and reliable in you. If their probing revealed that you react strongly to being ignored, silence becomes their tool. If they found that criticism of your parenting, your work, or your appearance produces visible distress, those areas become frequent targets. The manipulation is personalized. It is built from the data your reactions provided. The moment you genuinely stop being provocable, not through determined resistance, but through authentic internal change, this entire architecture collapses. The personalized strategy was built on data that no longer reflects reality. The buttons they identified have been rewired. The access points they mapped have been closed. And the new probing they conduct to update their model produces nothing useful, because your reactions no longer deliver the consistent behavioral data they depend on. What does it actually mean to stop being provocable? It does not mean nothing affects you. It means that what affects you internally does not automatically translate into visible behavioral response. The internal experience and the external expression become decoupled. Something may irritate you, and you know it irritates you, you feel it clearly, but that irritation no longer drives your behavior. You feel it, note it, and choose how to respond rather than simply reacting from it. This decoupling is the actual psychological achievement. There are specific areas where most people remain highly provocable without realizing it. Identity is the first. When something touches how we see ourselves, our competence, our integrity, our value as a parent, partner, or professional, the provocation connects to something deep. Toxic individuals learn your identity touchpoints quickly because your reactions to comments in those areas are usually significantly more intense. Developing security in your own self-perception that does not depend on others' recognition begins dismantling these identity-based provocations at their root. Social perception is the second high vulnerability area. Most people care deeply about how they are perceived by others, and manipulative personalities exploit this systematically. They make comments about what others think of you. They imply that your reputation is being affected. When your internal security no longer depends on managing others' perceptions of you, when you have achieved a genuine comfort with being misunderstood or evaluated unfairly, these provocations lose most of their force. Fairness is the third area. People with a strong sense of justice are unusually vulnerable to provocations involving unfairness. Toxic individuals who recognize this pattern use small, deliberate unfairnesses as reliable provocation tools because they know the reaction will be disproportionate to the specific event. Developing the capacity to observe injustice with clarity without being consumed by the emotional charge it creates is part of becoming genuinely unprovocable. When toxic people realize they cannot provoke you, several predictable things happen. Some increase their efforts dramatically before eventually reducing them. Some shift to entirely different approaches, suddenly becoming more agreeable, more flattering, in an attempt to re-establish the access that provocation no longer provides. Some withdraw from the relationship partially or entirely because the interaction no longer yields what they were seeking. Each of these responses confirms the same thing. Your emotional availability was a resource they depended on, and its removal changes the terms of the relationship at a fundamental level. You stop seeking permission to protect your peace. There is a deeply conditioned behavior in many people that operates almost entirely outside their conscious awareness. Before protecting their own peace, before withdrawing from a draining interaction, setting a limit, declining a request, or simply prioritizing their own well-being, they seek permission. Not formal, explicit permission. Psychological permission. They need to feel that their choice is justified, that the other person will understand, that the action is reasonable enough to be acceptable. Without that sense of permission, protecting their peace produces guilt that feels worse than the drain they were trying to avoid. Toxic individuals understand this pattern with precision. They do not grant permission. They create the conditions under which you feel that any act of self-protection requires justification, and then they make justification impossible. Whatever explanation you offer is insufficient. Whatever reasoning you provide is turned against you. Whatever boundary you attempt to draw is characterized as selfishness, overreaction, or evidence of some deeper personal failing. This cycle is designed to maintain access by making access withdrawal feel psychologically unjustifiable. As long as you believe you need their permission to protect your peace, they control whether you ever actually do. The shift away from permission seeking begins with a fundamental reconceptualization of where the right to protect your own peace comes from. It does not come from the understanding or agreement of the person whose behavior requires the protection. It does not come from external validation of whether your reasons are sufficient. It comes from your own assessment of what your psychological well-being requires, and that assessment requires no external endorsement to be legitimate. One of the most significant aspects of this habit is learning to act on self-protective instincts without first running them through a justification process designed to make them acceptable to someone else. When an interaction feels draining, harmful, or manipulative, the instinct to disengage is information. It is accurate psychological data about the nature of that interaction. Acting on that data, leaving the conversation, reducing contact, declining the request, is not something that requires the other person's agreement to be valid. Toxic individuals are highly skilled at making self-protective choices that feel cruel, irrational, or unfair. They reframe your withdrawal as abandonment. They characterize your limits as aggression. They transform your need for space into evidence of your coldness or your selfishness. These reframings are designed to activate guilt, and guilt is one of the most reliable access points that toxic relationships depend on. Learning to feel guilt, observe it clearly, and continue acting in alignment with your own well-being regardless of the guilt is one of the most difficult and most important elements of this habit. Protecting your peace without seeking permission also involves changing how you communicate self-protective choices. Most people overexplain. They provide detailed justifications, histories of the situation, evidence for why their choice is reasonable, all oriented toward achieving the other person's agreement. But over-explanation provides material for argument. Every detail you offer becomes a point that can be challenged. When you stop over-explaining, when you communicate self-protective choices briefly and clearly without the accompanying justification architecture, there is far less material available for dispute. The simple, clear statement, without extensive preamble, without elaborate reasoning, communicates something that over-explanation cannot. It communicates that the choice has already been made, that it is not a proposal awaiting approval. That agreement is not being sought because agreement is not required. When you stop seeking permission to protect your peace, certain people will experience your new directness as a fundamental change in the relationship dynamic. They will often respond by escalating, producing more elaborate justifications for why your self-protection is unjustified, creating situations designed to maximize your guilt, involving others in campaigns to establish that your choices are unreasonable. The sophistication of these responses confirms the degree to which your permission-seeking was a resource they had been depending on. Your calmness begins exposing other people's chaos. When a genuinely calm person enters a chaotic or manipulative interaction, the chaos often intensifies before it resolves. This counterintuitive pattern confuses many people into thinking their calmness is making the situation worse. In reality, it is making the situation more visible. The calm person is not creating chaos. The calm person's presence is removing the noise that was previously disguising the chaos, making it suddenly and starkly apparent in a way that both parties and observers can no longer avoid seeing. Chaos in the psychological sense is the operating mode of individuals who manage their internal discomfort by externalizing it, by creating movement, drama, conflict, and uncertainty in the people around them. This externalization serves multiple functions simultaneously. It keeps attention focused outward rather than inward on the person creating the disruption. It prevents others from thinking clearly enough to assess the situation accurately. It generates reactive states in everyone nearby that make those people easier to manage and control. Calm presence disrupts all of these functions simultaneously. When you do not react to manufactured drama, the drama has no place to land. When you do not absorb the emotional turbulence being broadcast, it remains with its source. When you continue thinking clearly while others are being pushed into reactive states, your clear thinking creates a visible contrast to the chaos around it. That contrast is uncomfortable for people whose behavior depends on everyone around them being similarly destabilized. Because a calm, clear-thinking person in the room is a witness, and witnesses to chaos are not welcomed by the people generating it. Most people navigate social interactions using consensus. They assess situations partly through how others around them are responding. If everyone in the room seems anxious, the individual assumes anxiety is the appropriate response. If everyone is walking on eggshells around a particular person, the individual assumes that person requires careful handling. Chaotic individuals often depend on this consensus to normalize their behavior. Your consistent calmness disrupts this consensus. When everyone else is walking on eggshells and you are not, the contrast raises questions, and those questions begin a process of reality testing in observers. Calmness also functions as a diagnostic tool that works automatically. In neutral, benign interactions, genuine calmness produces no particular effect. But in manipulative interactions, genuine calmness produces a specific and recognizable pattern of responses. The person whose behavior is manipulative becomes more insistent. Their emotional displays increase in intensity. Their provocations become more direct. All of this is the diagnostic result of applying calm to a context that depended on reactivity. The manipulative mechanism shows itself in the effort to defeat the calmness. Developing genuine rather than performed calmness is important because the difference is detectable. Performed calmness, the deliberate suppression of visible reaction while internal chaos continues, carries specific behavioral signatures. The jaw remains tight even as the words are measured. The stillness has a quality of effortfulness. Genuinely calm people do not exhibit these signatures because their calm comes from internal settledness rather than external management. There is a specific relational dynamic that your developing calmness exposes with particular clarity. Toxic relationships often have an unspoken emotional contract. The toxic person provides intermittent approval, connection, or validation, and in return, the other person provides reactivity, emotional availability, and behavioral compliance. Your calmness begins violating the terms of the contract from your side. You stop providing the reactivity and emotional availability that represent your contribution to the exchange. This contract violation creates a crisis for the toxic person, not because they care about you in a deep relational sense, but because the contract serves their functional needs, and its violation disrupts those functions. The exposure that your calmness creates eventually becomes impossible to ignore. When someone is behaving chaotically in an environment that is otherwise calm, the behavior stands out with a clarity that is impossible in a generally chaotic environment. Other people begin noticing. The chaotic person's behavior, deprived of the normalizing effect of universal reactivity, begins appearing for what it actually is. And once something is clearly visible, the collective story built around it begins to change. You rebuild from within and stop needing them to understand. The final habit operates at a deeper level than all the preceding ones. The first 6 habits change what you do, how you respond, what you show, what you allow. This 7th habit changes something more fundamental. It changes what you need. Specifically, it ends the quiet, persistent need for toxic people to understand you, validate you, acknowledge the impact of their behavior, or provide the recognition that would make the relationship make sense. That need, when it exists, keeps people perpetually oriented toward the very individuals who are harming them. The need for a toxic person's understanding is one of the most tenacious psychological bonds that exists in these dynamics. It feels completely reasonable from the inside. You know what happened. You experienced the impact. It seems only fair that the person who created that impact should understand it and acknowledge it. The impulse toward this understanding is not pathological. It is a normal human drive toward justice, toward relational coherence, toward resolution. The problem is not the impulse itself. The problem is directing it towards someone who, by definition of their psychological structure, cannot provide what the impulse seeks. Toxic individuals and genuinely manipulative personalities are not withholding understanding strategically in most cases. They are structurally unable to provide it in the way it is needed. Understanding of the kind being sought, genuine empathic recognition of how their behavior affected you, accompanied by authentic accountability, requires a level of emotional self-confrontation that their psychological architecture does not support. Every attempt to make them understand becomes, from their perspective, an attack that activates their defenses, producing not understanding but further manipulation, further blame shifting, further reframing of the narrative in ways that preserve their self-image. When you finally internalize this, not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived understanding that settles into certainty, the orientation toward them changes completely. You stop bringing your internal experience to them for recognition. You stop explaining how their behavior landed. You stop presenting evidence of harm in hopes that sufficient evidence will eventually produce the acknowledgement you have been seeking. You understand with genuine clarity that the acknowledgement will not come, not because of anything about you or the validity of your experience, but because of the fundamental psychological limitations of the person you are hoping will provide it. If the understanding, validation, and acknowledgement you sought from them will not come from them, where does it come from? It comes from yourself. This sounds simple and is profoundly difficult. Building genuine self-validation, the capacity to know your own experience accurately, to trust your own perceptions, to hold your own emotional reality as real and important without requiring external confirmation, is the foundational psychological project underneath all the other habits. Self-validation does not mean deciding you are always right. It does not mean closing yourself to honest feedback or genuine input from people who can actually provide it. It means developing the capacity to be the primary source of your own psychological recognition. Your experiences happened. Your feelings are real. Your perceptions, while not infallible, are worth taking seriously. Your well-being matters independent of whether anyone else at this moment is actively affirming that it does. Rebuilding from within also involves a gradual redirection of attention. People in toxic relationships spend enormous cognitive energy oriented toward the toxic person, analyzing their behavior, trying to understand their motivations, predicting their next move, managing their reactions. When this energy is redirected inward, toward understanding your own patterns, developing your own clarity, building your own psychological resources, the quality of your inner life changes dramatically. You think your own thoughts again rather than spending most of your cognitive bandwidth thinking about someone else. Part of this rebuilding involves honest examination of what the relationship provided that made its cost sustainable for so long. Toxic relationships rarely offer nothing. They typically offer intermittent rewards significant enough to maintain the connection through the damage. Identifying what those rewards were, what needs they addressed however inadequately, and what genuinely healthy sources might address those same needs more reliably is essential work. It prevents the pattern from simply replicating itself with a different person once this particular relationship dynamic is resolved. There is also a grief element to this habit that is often underacknowledged. When you stop needing a toxic person to understand you, you are also releasing the hope that this person could be what you needed them to be. That hope, in many cases, was sustaining a relationship long after its actual terms became clear. Letting go of the hope is a loss, a genuine loss that deserves to be grieved rather than dismissed. The relationship you hoped for did not exist. The person you needed them to be is not who they are. Moving through that grief rather than around it is what makes the release genuine rather than merely performative. When you have rebuilt sufficiently from within, when your own self-perception, self-validation, and psychological resources no longer depend on what this particular person provides or withholds, your presence changes completely. You no longer approach interactions with them carrying the invisible weight of unresolved need. You are simply present, clear, and self-contained. And that self-containment is the final thing that toxic individuals find most difficult to manage. Because their entire approach assumed an emotional need they could leverage. A person with no leverageable need is, to a manipulative mind, simply beyond reach. This is what the full development of all 7 habits eventually produces. Not a person who has become invulnerable through hardness. Not someone who has closed themselves to connection. Someone who has become genuinely self-directing, whose emotional life is internally generated rather than externally extracted, whose responses are chosen rather than conditioned, whose peace does not require anyone's permission, whose understanding of themselves does not await anyone's confirmation. That person does not need to intimidate anyone. Their presence simply does not offer what manipulation requires. Toxic people never expected you to become emotionally disciplined. They expected reactions, explanations, emotional access whenever they created pressure. But the moment you become calm under tension, difficult to provoke, and comfortable protecting your peace without guilt, the entire dynamic changes. Suddenly, the person who once felt powerful around you starts feeling uncertain around your silence. Because manipulation only works when someone can emotionally reach you on demand. And these 7 habits quietly remove that access. Not through aggression. Not through dominance. Through control. Real psychological strength is not loud. It is measured. It is intentional. And once toxic people realize they can no longer predict your emotions, influence your reactions, or pull you into emotional chaos, they stop seeing you as easy to control and start seeing you as someone they can no longer move.